It was a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, December 7, 1941. The sun hadn't yet burned through the haze that hung over Oahu, and most of the island's servicemen were still asleep. It was supposed to be a day off. A peaceful morning. But out on a lonely ridge north of Honolulu, two Army privates were watching a strange signal crawl across a screen that looked like something out of science fiction. One of those men, 20-year-old Joseph Lockard, didn't know it yet, but in a matter of minutes, he'd spot the largest air assault in American history. And the impossible part? Nobody believed him. Lockard wasn't a pilot, a general, or even a seasoned soldier. He was a radar operator, a civilian at heart, who had learned the ropes of a new technology the Army barely understood itself. Radar was experimental back then, and to most officers, it was more curiosity than weapon. The military called it SCR-270, a machine the size of a small truck, powered by vacuum tubes and humming with electricity. When the screen lit up with a moving blip, it meant something was out there. But no one yet understood how powerful it could be. The radar station at Opana Point was little more than a shack on a hill, surrounded by red dirt and scrub. It overlooked the Pacific, miles from the main base at Pearl Harbor. Lockard and his partner, Private George Elliott, had been on duty since 4 a.m. It was supposed to be a training shift, routine, nothing to see, nothing to report. They were both tired, hungry, and ready to head back for breakfast when the first faint echoes appeared on the green cathode screen. Lockard leaned forward, squinting. "You seeing that, George?" he asked. Elliott nodded. "Yeah. Looks big, real big." It was 7:02 a.m. The radar beam swept again, and this time the blip stretched clear across the screen. It wasn't just one plane. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, coming in from the north. Lockard's hand froze on the control dial. He'd never seen anything like it. At first, he thought it had to be a glitch. Maybe the radar was miscalibrated. But the returns were strong, too strong to ignore. Elliott scribbled notes on a clipboard. They both knew they were supposed to shut down the radar at 7 a.m. sharp. That was the routine. But Lockard's gut told him something was off. "Let's keep it running a bit longer," he said. "Just to see what happens." That decision, staying an extra 15 minutes, was the impossible trick that would make his name echo through history. The two men checked their watch. 7:05, the signal grew larger. Lockard turned the gain down, trying to sharpen the image. The blips were now only about 130 miles out, closing fast. If those were aircraft, they'd be over Oahu in less than an hour. Elliott's hand shook slightly as he picked up the phone. The communication line connected to the Army's information center at Fort Shafter, where incoming radar reports were supposed to be analyzed by officers on duty. At the other end of that line sat a young lieutenant named Kermit Tyler. It was only his second time on watch duty. He'd been assigned as an observer, not a controller. Tyler wasn't a radar man. He didn't know much about the equipment, and he had no idea what the signatures on those screens could mean. He was there mostly to gain experience. Elliott made the call. Lockard listened beside him, his heart racing. "Information Center, this is Opana Station," Elliott said. "We have a very large plot of planes coming in, bearing about 3 degrees east of north, range about 137 miles. There was a pause. Tyler's voice came back, calm, even casual. "Well, don't worry about it," he said. "There's a flight of B-17s coming in from the mainland today." Lockard and Elliott looked at each other. The B-17s? They'd heard something about a group of bombers flying in from California. But this return was too big, far too big for a dozen planes. Elliott hesitated. "Sir, it's an awfully large echo." "Forget it," Tyler interrupted. "Nothing to worry about." The line went dead. Lockard leaned back in his chair, silent. The hum of the radar filled the small room. Outside, the sky was turning gold over the Pacific. He felt an unease in his stomach he couldn't explain. He turned to Elliott and said quietly, "That's the biggest plot I've ever seen." The signal kept coming closer. At 7:39 a.m., Lockard finally shut down the set. His shift was over. They packed their gear and started walking down the hill, the tropical breeze warm on their faces. Down at the base, men were cleaning their barracks and lining up for church. Over the horizon, Japanese carrier planes were already forming into attack waves. Lockard's impossible trick, staying on just 15 minutes longer, had spotted the first incoming attack force of Pearl Harbor nearly an hour before the bombs began to fall. But because one man dismissed the warning, the information was lost in the noise. When the first explosions rocked Battleship Row, Lockard and Elliot were halfway down the ridge. They heard the low rumble of engines first, then the distant thunder of bombs. At first, they thought it was a drill. Then they saw the black smoke rising over the harbor. "Jesus Christ, George," Lockard said. "They're real." Down below, chaos unfolded. Japanese torpedo planes swept low across the water, releasing their deadly loads toward the anchored ships. Dive bombers screamed from the sky, their sirens wailing. The USS Arizona erupted in a massive fireball that sent a mushroom cloud hundreds of feet high. Within minutes, the Pacific Fleet was crippled. Lockard and Elliot raced back to their truck, desperate to warn anyone who would listen. But the lines were jammed, and confusion reigned. The radar station had done its job. The warning had been seen. But it had been ignored. To understand how this happened, you have to look at who Joseph Lockard was, and how radar itself was seen in 1941. Lockard had grown up in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. He'd been working as a radio repairman before joining the Army Signal Corps. He wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense, more of a tinkerer, a man fascinated by machines. In later interviews, he said, "I loved the equipment. It was something new, something we were just beginning to understand." That curiosity made him one of the earliest trained radar operators in the U.S. military. But in 1941, the technology was so new, so secret, that few even knew what it did. The Army had set up 6 mobile radar stations across Oahu, meant to act as an early warning network. The operators were all young men like Lockard, mostly technicians rather than officers. The stations ran on a shoestring schedule, 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. daily. After that, they were shut down. Nobody expected an attack after breakfast. Radar in those days could pick up aircraft at about 150 miles if conditions were good. The screens showed faint green arcs, each blip representing a plane. But the system was still crude. Operators had to read it by eye, adjusting knobs, plotting positions by hand. It took skill, intuition, and a lot of guesswork. Lockard's training had been brief, just enough to understand the basics. But he'd practiced enough to spot differences between weather, flocks of birds, and actual aircraft. That morning, he trusted his gut. Something told him the radar wasn't lying. When he later recalled the events, Lockard said, "If we'd had a system where someone would have believed us, maybe things would have been different." But at the time, radar wasn't taken seriously. The information center that day was only partially manned. The duty officers were still eating breakfast. The phones weren't even fully staffed. The Army and Navy were still arguing over who controlled radar intelligence. It was bureaucracy at its worst, and it cost lives. Lockard's call had technically been logged, but the record vanished amid the chaos that followed. For decades, historians debated whether the warning could have changed anything. Some argue that even if the alarm had been sounded, there wouldn't have been enough time to prepare. The Japanese planes were too close. Others, though, believe the entire Pacific Fleet could have gone to battle stations, that aircraft could have been scrambled, that the ships could have closed watertight doors, saving hundreds of lives. For Lockard, the impossible trick wasn't about radar. It was about instinct, the sense that something was wrong when everyone else thought things were fine. After the attack, Lockard and Elliot were ordered to report immediately to Fort Shafter for debriefing. The officers there were stunned when they realized these 2 low-ranking men had seen the incoming raid before it hit. A colonel questioned them for hours, trying to understand how the system had failed. Lockard calmly explained every detail: the time, the bearing, the range, the size of the return. At one point, an officer asked, "Why didn't you insist that the warning be passed higher up?" Lockard replied, "Sir, we did. But we were told not to worry." Those 6 words, "We were told not to worry," became a haunting symbol of Pearl Harbor's unheeded warning. In the weeks after the attack, blame spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed stories about radar operators who had seen the enemy coming but weren't believed. Congress launched an investigation. Lockard's name appeared in reports and testimonies. He was summoned to testify before the Roberts Commission, the official inquiry into the disaster. During the hearings, he spoke quietly but firmly. "We had a large echo on the screen," he said. "It was something I'd never seen before. We reported it, but the reply we got was that it must be the expected flight of bombers." The commission found no fault in Lockard or Elliott. In fact, they commended them for doing their duty. But the failure of the chain of command stood out as one of the great missed opportunities in American military history. Lockard's radar had detected the Japanese attack force at a distance of 132 miles, roughly 50 minutes warning time. The operator's persistence in keeping the radar on after hours was what made the detection possible. Had they followed orders strictly, the radar would have been shut off, and the Japanese would have arrived entirely unobserved. After the hearings, Lockard faded from the spotlight. He returned stateside, continued his work in the Signal Corps, and eventually left the military. For years, he spoke little about that morning. When he finally gave interviews decades later, he said, "People called it an impossible trick. But it wasn't magic. We just stayed on a few extra minutes." But that act, staying a few extra minutes, represented something deeply human: intuition, vigilance, and the quiet determination of ordinary people who do their jobs when no one's watching. For older Americans who lived through the war, the story of Joseph Lockard became a cautionary tale about listening to the quiet voices, the ones who see trouble coming before the rest of us do. It also reflected how unprepared the United States was on that December morning. The military had the tools. The warnings were there. But the belief wasn't. Lockard later described what it felt like to stand on the ridge as the bombs fell. "We could see the smoke rising in the distance," he said. "We didn't know what to do. We just stood there, watching. It didn't seem real." In his eyes, that morning was a mixture of pride and pain: pride in having done his duty, pain in knowing it hadn't made a difference. The irony was cruel. The first American to detect the attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't a general or an admiral. It was a young civilian-trained radar operator with a knack for electronics. Even today, historians still debate how much his warning could have changed. But there's no denying one fact: Joseph Lockard and George Elliott saw Japan's attack coming before anyone else in the U.S. military. And for 15 minutes, they held the key to history in their hands. Lockard's life after the war was quiet. He married, raised a family, and worked in telecommunications. He rarely spoke publicly about Pearl Harbor, but when he did, he always mentioned the same lesson. "Machines can tell you something," he said, "but you have to have people willing to believe it." When the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, the world had changed forever. More than 2,400 Americans were dead, the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, and a stunned nation found itself at war. For most people, December 7th became a blur of headlines, speeches, and grief. But for Joseph Lockard, it was personal. He knew that in some small, haunting way, he had seen the first sign of it coming. In the days that followed, Lockard and George Elliott were ordered to keep quiet about what they'd seen. The Army didn't want rumors spreading about a missed warning. Officially, the radar stations had performed as expected. Unofficially, many officers were furious, and embarrassed, that 2 enlisted men had detected the Japanese fleet before any general had even finished breakfast. Lockard later recalled, "They told us not to talk to the press. We didn't argue. We just did what we were told." He was only 20 years old, standing in the middle of one of history's greatest catastrophes, and all he could do was replay those last few minutes on the radar screen. The Army quickly began piecing together what had happened. Investigators traced every call, every logbook entry, every minute leading up to the attack. The timeline was devastatingly clear. At 7:02 a.m., Opana Station detected a large group of aircraft. At 7:20, the information center logged a phone call from the radar operators. At 7:45, the Japanese planes appeared on Oahu's northern horizon. At 7:55, the first bombs fell. That 53-minute window, barely an hour, has become one of the most analyzed periods in American military history. If the warning had been acted upon immediately, interceptors at Wheeler Field might have taken off. Anti-aircraft batteries could have been manned. Ships might have sealed watertight doors. No one knows exactly how many lives could have been saved, but historians estimate it could have been in the hundreds. When the Roberts Commission convened in early 1942, Lockard was called to testify in Washington. He wore his best uniform, nervous but determined to tell the truth. Senators and generals leaned over their microphones as he described the radar signal that morning, how he'd adjusted the gain, seen the huge echo, and called it in. When asked why he hadn't sounded an alarm himself, Lockard replied, "Sir, we were told it was not our place. We reported it as we were instructed." His words struck a chord. Here was a young private who had done everything right, yet the system above him had failed completely. The Commission's final report praised Lockard and Elliott for their alertness and initiative, but condemned the breakdown of communication between the radar unit and the higher command. It was an uncomfortable truth: America had the warning. It simply hadn't listened. After his testimony, Lockard returned to duty quietly. He served in radar operations throughout the war, helping improve the very systems that had been ignored at Pearl Harbor. Radar quickly became one of the most vital tools in the Allied arsenal. By 1944, it was guiding bombers over Europe, spotting U-boats in the Atlantic, and tracking kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. The same technology that had once been dismissed as experimental now formed the invisible shield protecting America's forces. Lockard later said, "It was strange to see how fast everyone changed their minds about radar. After Pearl, nobody called it a toy anymore." But the personal cost of that morning lingered. For years, Lockard carried a quiet guilt, an ache that no recognition could erase. In an interview decades later, he said, "People used to tell me, you couldn't have stopped it. Maybe they're right. But when you've seen it coming, and nobody listens, that stays with you." George Eliot felt the same way. He stayed in the service after the war but rarely spoke about the radar sighting. "We did our job," he told a friend in the 1960s. "That's all there is to it. The rest wasn't up to us." For both men, the story of December 7th wasn't just about history, it was about how ordinary people can see extraordinary things, and how bureaucracy can smother truth in a sea of routine. In the broader picture, their experience became a lesson that reshaped U.S. defense policy. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the Army and Navy created a unified early warning network across the mainland and Pacific outposts. Radar operators were given direct authority to sound alerts without waiting for officer approval. Communication channels were streamlined. The failure of that one morning forced a revolution in how America handled intelligence. Lockard's story also influenced civilian science. Universities like MIT and Caltech launched major radar research labs, leading to the development of microwave radar, airborne detection, and even the foundations of modern air traffic control. In a sense, every time a pilot lands safely guided by radar today, they owe a silent thanks to that lonely hilltop in 1941. Still, recognition for the two young operators was slow to come. For decades after the war, official histories of Pearl Harbor barely mentioned their names. The spotlight focused on admirals, presidents, and carrier commanders. It wasn't until the 1960s, as documents were declassified, that the full story resurfaced. Lockard was living in Arizona by then, working as an electronics engineer. A reporter tracked him down for an interview. "Do you ever think about that morning?" the reporter asked. Lockard smiled faintly. "Every December 7th, he said. "I still see that blip on the screen." He described the radar equipment in vivid detail: the generator's hum, the way the oscilloscope glowed in the dim light, the faint tremor of the signal. "You have to understand," he said, "radar was so new that nobody had ever seen a formation that size before. We thought maybe it was a malfunction. But the returns were perfect. Clean. Strong. That's when I knew it was real." He paused, then added, "If I'd been higher up the ladder, maybe I could have forced someone to act. But I was just a corporal. We did our job. That's all." In the following years, several historians began championing Lockard and Elliott's contribution. Authors like Gordon Prang and Roberta Wallstetter cited their story as evidence of how close the U.S. had come to detecting the attack in time. In 1981, during the 40th anniversary commemorations, surviving veterans of the Signal Corps invited Lockard to speak in Honolulu. Standing before a crowd of gray-haired soldiers and sailors, he told the story once more. He said, "People talk about Pearl Harbor as a surprise. And for most folks, it was. But for 15 minutes, up on that hill, we saw it coming. That's something I'll never forget." The audience fell silent. Many had never heard his name before. But they understood the weight of his words. What made Lockard's impossible trick so remarkable wasn't just the technology, it was the mindset behind it. He and Elliot broke routine. They stayed past their shift because something didn't feel right. That decision defied orders, but it was driven by intuition, the kind of judgment that can't be written into manuals. For older generations who lived through the war, that kind of initiative embodied what Americans valued most: responsibility, vigilance, and courage in the quiet moments before disaster. Radar historian Lewis Brown once wrote, "Lockard's 15 minutes were the most significant in early radar history. In those minutes, he proved that electronic vision could outsee the human eye." After the 1980s, Lockard largely retreated from public life. He passed away in 1978 in Pennsylvania, though his story continued to inspire radar operators and historians alike. George Elliot died a few years later. Neither man became famous, but among those who studied the events of Pearl Harbor, their names remained symbols of duty fulfilled against impossible odds. The irony of Lockard's life is that his impossible trick was actually simple: he trusted what he saw. In an era when most men deferred to rank and authority, he trusted his own instruments and instincts. That single decision, keeping the radar on for 15 extra minutes, became one of the most quietly heroic acts in American history. Let's step back for a moment to understand just how extraordinary that decision was. The SCR-270 radar system wasn't easy to use. It required constant calibration. Operators had to tune frequency and gain manually, interpret faint signals by eye, and track moving objects by marking grease pencil spots on a transparent overlay. On that morning, the radar was running on a temporary power supply, and the truck's generator had been acting up. Lockard could easily have shut it down and gone for breakfast. No one would have blamed him. Instead, he trusted a hunch. In a later interview, he described his thought process. "It just didn't look right. The size of the return, it wasn't anything we'd seen before. My first thought was a big flight coming in from the States. But then I thought, it's too early, and it's coming from the wrong direction. So I told Elliot, let's just keep it going." That's the moment history pivoted on. Two young men, standing in a dusty hut with a humming screen, decided to wait and watch. After the war, Lockard's experience shaped military training. Radar operators were taught not just to read the machines, but to question, to double-check, to act when instinct warned them something was wrong. The U.S. Air Defense Command, established in 1948, built its doctrine around one central rule: trust the radar. It's a rule that began with Lockard. Over the years, there were occasional attempts to downplay the Opana Station incident. Some officers argued that even if the alarm had been raised, confusion would have delayed action. Others claimed that Tyler, the duty officer, had simply followed procedure. But to many veterans, the moral was clear: never dismiss the eyes on the ground. In 1991, for the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, surviving Signal Corps veterans placed a small bronze plaque at the old Opana Point site. It read, "From this station, at 7:02 a.m., December 7, 1941, radar operators Joseph L. Lockard and George E. Elliot detected the approach of enemy aircraft." The plaque stands on the windswept ridge overlooking the Pacific, the same view the two men had that morning. The radar trucks are gone, replaced by grass and sea breeze, but the view remains: endless blue ocean stretching toward the horizon. Visitors often describe a sense of eerie calm, as if the ghosts of that morning still linger in the air. A local historian once said, "That hill reminds us that technology can warn us, but only if people listen." Lockard's family attended that ceremony. His daughter, Susan, gave a short speech. "Dad never called himself a hero," she said. "He always said he was just doing his job. But we know that job changed history, even if the world didn't realize it right away." For many older Americans, the name Joseph Lockard now sits beside others who were ignored before disaster struck, men who tried to warn their country, and were met with disbelief. His story became a symbol of how ordinary citizens often see the truth first. As time passed, the legend of his impossible trick took on a deeper meaning. It wasn't about radar anymore, it was about human nature. We all like to believe we'd recognize danger when it appears on the horizon. But more often, warnings come quietly, from people without rank or fame, doing their jobs in silence. In 1941, That warning came from a young radar operator who decided to keep the machine running a few minutes longer. In that small act of persistence lay one of history's great what-ifs. Would America have been ready if someone had listened? We'll never know for sure. But Joseph Lockard's decision ensured that the first chapter of Pearl Harbor's story wasn't total blindness. For a fleeting moment, America saw the storm coming. Looking back decades later, a retired general who'd reviewed the Roberts Commission files wrote, "Lockard's detection stands as proof that the men on the front lines often understand the situation better than their superiors." The tragedy was not in the detection, but in the disbelief. That disbelief turned into a national obsession after the war. "Remember Pearl Harbor" became a rallying cry, but hidden within it was another lesson: remember those who warned you. For Lockard, that warning became both a burden and a badge of honor. He once told a fellow veteran, "If I had to do it all over again, I'd stay on the set even longer." He paused, then added with a faint smile, "Of course, they probably would have yelled at me for breaking routine again." That line captures his character perfectly: humble, duty-bound, and quietly stubborn. The kind of man who makes a difference not through orders, but through conviction. When we think about Pearl Harbor today, the images are grand: battleships exploding, planes diving, flames rising into the sky. But before all of that, before the first siren wailed, the story began in silence, with a flicker on a screen and two young men in a hut. That's the real power of Lockard's story. It reminds us that history isn't just made in the halls of command or on the decks of battleships. Sometimes it's made by people nobody notices until it's too late. And perhaps that's why his impossible trick still resonates with older Americans today. It speaks to a time when duty meant doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. It's a story about paying attention, trusting your instincts, and never assuming that calm means safety. When asked once what he wanted people to remember, Lockard said, "Just remember that we saw them coming." That's all. He didn't seek medals or fame. He didn't write a book or tour the country. He simply wanted the record to show that radar had worked, and that the men who operated it had done their duty. Today, in military academies and radar training schools, his name occasionally appears in lectures. Students learn about Opana Point, about the SCR-270, and about the call that wasn't believed. They learn that technology is only as strong as the trust we place in it, and in each other. And somewhere out on that Hawaiian ridge, where the wind hums through the grass and the ocean glitters below, the story still lingers, the tale of one civilian's impossible trick that spotted Japan's attack before Pearl Harbor, a moment when a quiet warning could have changed everything. Because sometimes, the difference between catastrophe and readiness isn't fate or luck, it's whether someone listens when a young radar operator says, "Sir, something's coming."